Hello everyone, today we're going to be learning a few different techniques: background blending, palm trees and birds. I'll be showing you a few different ways you can create your background using a palette knife and a couple of different brushes so you can experiment and choose which one you prefer. We'll then be painting in our palm tree and we'll finish off with a couple of birds flying in the distance. I'll be sharing with you the colours that I've chosen and the brands of paint and any other equipment that I'm also using, and then we'll go through everything nice and slowly. I'll be showing you the few techniques that I'm using so you can try it out as well. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the tutorial and I'll talk you through all of the equipment we're going to need for this painting. To start with, I've got a canvas. This is a stretched canvas and it's a size 8 by 10. I have a paint palette pad here. I've then got an array of different brushes. I'm not going to use all of these, but I like having them on standby just so I can decide which ones I want to use for the painting. So I'd advise you do the same as well. Just make sure that you've got a small one for the details and a couple of slanted ones are also advised for the palm trees. I've also got a palette knife here because I want to experiment with adding the paint to the background using the palette knife. And then a kitchen towel, a glass of water to wash our brushes with. And then I'm going to start adding my paint. So I'm starting with some titanium white. This is the System 3, and I'm going to add quite a lot of this to my palette because I'm going to be mixing up some pastel colours. This is Ultramarine Blue by Winsor & Newton, Phthalo Blue, Winsor & Newton, Sap Green by System 3, Hooker's Green, System 3. The next two colours come in our art kit, which is Primary Magenta, which is a pink colour, and Cadmium Yellow. I'm going to start with my palette knife and I'm just going to pick up some white paint. Now this is really fun. This is where you can experiment with being a little bit more abstract and impressionist with your background. So I'm starting with some white paint and then just adding a little bit of blue, and I'm just dabbing it next to it and on top of that white. I'm then picking up some of the Phthalo Blue, which is more of a turquoise colour, adding some white on top, and I'm just dotting this towards the top sort of section of my canvas. This is where the blue of the sky is going to be. And this is the fun bit because we're now just going to essentially shush all of this paint onto the canvas. You can push it down, let the paint mix together. You'll see that you'll get a few stripes and a few different tones coming through by using this method. So the reason why I want to show you 3 different methods is you can decide which one you prefer and which style you want to go for with your painting. I always suggest adding the white. It's a good mixer. It's quite nice to experiment with your colours as well. I've gone for these blues as the top section just to kind of have that sky colour in the top. I've then picked up a big round brush and I'm using swirling motions, just pushing down quite lightly to blend this paint together. What will happen here is, because we've already applied the paint to the canvas in quite a thick way, we're going to get the different tones of the paint coming through. So it's quite nice not to overly blend it if you don't want to. Again, you can be quite choppy and free with your brush strokes. They don't have to be too neat, and you might prefer this technique. I always say it's nice to experiment. You can always go back to one of the other techniques as well if you prefer, and you can just add the different layers. But I love the fact that you can see the different sort of colours coming through. We're not going to overly blend them at this point, just in case you want to keep your painting in this sort of style. So I'm painting the sides, the top and the bottom of my canvas today. You don't have to do this. Some artists choose to do it, some artists choose not to. It's totally up to you and personal preference. If you are painting the sides, I would always recommend doing it as you go, just to keep the colour consistent with what's happening on the front of the canvas. This way it just looks like the painting wraps around the sides, the top and the bottom. As you can see, the paint is still very thick on the front of the canvas, so you can either go ahead and blend it in more, or you might like to leave it thick as well. Totally up to you. What I want to do now is I want to create a transition between the blue colours and the warmer colours that I'm going to be using for the sunset, which is the pink and the yellow. So I'm just blending this lighter colour down slightly, but I'm leaving enough gap at the base to make sure that those warm colours have got space to shine through and they're not going to overly mix with the cooler shades. I'm now just wiping off my palette knife with a spare bit of kitchen towel, so you can also do this. Just make sure you're getting all of that blue off. And then I'm picking up some white, and I'm just adding this randomly to the base of my canvas, just to the bottom part, and this is just going to act as the first layer of the paint, which we can then blend the warmer colours into. So go ahead and pick up your pink or your yellow, whatever colour you're going for, and I'm just mixing this on top and next to. You can see I'm being very free with how I'm adding this on there. Now I want the pink and the blue to mix together slightly when I start to blend them together, because this will create a slightly more mauve or purple shade. So I'm just making sure that that pink is underneath the blue, and then I'm adding the yellow underneath so that that yellow can really pop. If the yellow and the blue mix together, it will make a green colour. So I'm just trying to separate those two colours. I'm giving that round big brush a good wash just to make sure all of those cooler tones are off. Giving it a good dry on a kitchen towel before we go ahead and blend in these shades. I'm going to concentrate on the pink area first, and I'm just doing very light swirls clockwise and anti-clockwise, just merging in the pink and the white paint together. You can see I'm working quite quickly, and the reason why I work quite quickly is it means I don't overthink what I'm doing. I'm then going ahead and blending in some of that white and the yellow to mix in with the pink, which should give us a lovely sort of peach tone. And just make sure you're painting the bottoms and the sides as you go, if you've been doing that throughout the rest of the painting. If you need to, you can always add a little bit of water to your brush. This will just help the paint go a little bit further. So when you're ready, we're now going to start blending in this pink and the blue together. I'm using a very light touch, and I'm still sticking with that clockwise and anti-clockwise swirling motions, and this should just start helping us blend those two colours together. And as that pink meets the blue, we should start to see a slightly more mauve or purple shade forming in our sky. And as you can see, I'm being quite choppy and messy with my application. Now this is the second technique, so if you like this application, you like the paint looking a little bit more messy, then I would stick with this. It's a very abstract, impressionist style. If not, we're going to pick up a fluffy brush, and if you haven't got a brush like this, you can always use an old makeup brush if you have one of those lying around. It's the same thing. And I'm very lightly, almost just dusting the tip of this brush over the painting in swirling motions, dabbing it in, and I'm just starting to create a little bit more of a hazy blended look between these colours. I would recommend starting with your pinks and your yellows just to make sure they're still very hot and they're not mixing too much with the cooler tones. And then once you've sort of blended those in, you can then merge the colours up slightly to mix in with your blues. I'm really pushing down very lightly. It is more like a dusting rather than buffering it out too much. You don't want to push down too hard. I would then just recommend wiping off any of that excess paint from your brush, just on a spare bit of towel, and then you can go back into your cooler shades and do the same thing. So anywhere where you had thicker paint, this is now where you're going to really start blending that paint into the canvas. Now it should still be wet enough for it to blend in nicely. If you leave it too long, this won't work. So you want to make sure that you're definitely doing this when the paint is still a bit tacky or still a little bit wet. I recommend stopping what you're doing and taking a little step back every so often, just to make sure that you're not overly blending. We don't want it to look too muddy, especially where those two colours meet. It's knowing when to stop with this technique, because it's quite fun. You can really get carried away with it. It's very therapeutic and relaxing to do. And I'm just checking the sides to make sure there are no gaps. I'm just buffering that paint to merge them together on either side. What we're now going to do is just give the brushes or the equipment that we've used a really good wash, and we can freshen up our water as well. We now want to wait for the paint to dry. I'm now adding some burnt umber by Systems 3 to my paint palette. If you haven't got any brown, you can just add a little bit of red, and you can mix up your own brown using some red, some blue, or some red and black, or red, blue, black and yellow. So starting with one of my smaller brushes, I've got an angled brush here. I'm just picking up some white paint, just adding it to a spare area of my palette. I'm going to start mixing in some burnt umber. We're going to start creating the colours for our palm tree now. We're going to create 3 or 4 colours here. Just picking up some more white, and I'm not washing off my brush. Adding in some more of the burnt umber, and this time I'm going to add a little bit of my yellow and a little bit of my sap green. Don't worry if your colours don't look exactly like mine, as long as you've got 2 or 3 different shades of browns or brown and greens, that's all that matters. Now just adding a little bit more of the hooker's green and some more burnt umber. I just want to change up this colour slightly. Just adding some more burnt umber to darken this shade up. Next up, I'm adding some burnt umber, some hooker's green, and giving it a good mix with whatever's left on my brush. Now this should be a darker shade. I'm going to continue to add some more green to it just to give it a slightly more earthy green undertone. So you can see here I have 3 different shades, a lighter, a mid, and then a darker sort of green tone. I'd then wash off your brush, and the trick here is we want to add some water into the paint. Because we're using acrylic paint, it can dry quite quickly, and we want to make sure it's nice and fluid when we come to drawing on our palm tree. So I'm going to use this first shade as the trunk, and we're simply just going to do a very slight curved line, and I'm sticking this more towards the right hand side of my canvas. Just bringing it down, leaving enough space at the top for all of our palm leaves. If we go too high, the palm leaves will sort of stick off the side of the canvas, so just make sure you're leaving enough space. And I'm keeping this trunk fairly thin. It's up to you how long and how thick you want to do it, depends on the size of the canvas, but I'd just say start thinner, you can always make it thicker as you go. Next up, I'm moving to a slightly smaller brush. This has still got an angle on it, and I'm picking up the medium shade. I'm now just going to start adding some shadows and some details. So I'm starting by dragging this colour along the left-hand side of the tree trunk here. Because the paint underneath is still wet, it should blend in quite nicely. We don't want to completely cover up the first shade, but this is just a nice suggestion that there's a little bit of shadow going on the tree trunk. Next up, picking up a really small tiny brush and going in with my darkest shade, we're now going to do the little lines that you would sort of find down the palm tree itself on the trunk. It's quite textured, so you can really have fun with this, and actually the edges are a little bit curved as well, so if you want to, you can add slight curved shapes just along the edge of the trunk, just like I'm doing here, just to suggest that it's a little bit wonky and wobbly. The lovely thing about this painting is we're creating nature, so it never is straight or neat or symmetrical, and each palm tree is individual and comes with its own personality, so you can have a little bit of artistic license to change this up as much as possible. You can also go very abstract with this if you want to as well. So I'm just adding a few extra lines just to add some little bit more detail to the trunk, and if you want to be quite thick with your paint, you can. I'm just doing a little dance between the colours, just building up these layers slightly. So it's up to you how long you want to spend on this. You can kind of keep adding and tweaking for a while. Just adding a little bit of a darker shade to my small brush and just adding a little bit more shadow, texture, detail to the trunk of the tree. Once you're happy, we're going to move back over to our other brushes and give them a good wash in the water. And then picking up that medium slanted brush, I'm going to start creating a few different green colours that I'll be using for the leaves. So starting with some white, I'm just adding a bit of the sap green to this and mixing it together. And then adding a little bit of yellow too. Again, you can experiment with your colours, you don't have to follow along with me. Just adding a tiny bit of blue to that mixture. Experiment with your colours, because all we're going to be doing is having 2 or 3 different shades that we'll be using for our palm tree. And if you don't like the colours that you're using, you don't have to use them, you can always start again. So I'm starting with some hooker green for the next colour, and I haven't washed off my brush. I'm adding a little bit of brown paint to this, giving it a good mix. I'd also just suggest make sure you're mixing up enough paint so that you don't have to keep mixing up more. Adding a tiny bit of blue to another area of my palette and just adding in some yellow paint. Blue and yellow mixed together makes green. It gives you a slightly more earthy, darker tone of green as well, which I quite like. As long as you've got 2 or 3 or 4 different shades of green, that's all that matters. Again, I would suggest adding a bit of water to this as you go, really mixing it in. This will just help keep the paint nice and fluid, and it will give us a lovely crisp line as we go to paint on our lovely palm leaves. So I'm starting with my lightest green first, and I'm going to be using this to draw in the stalks. So going over to the top of my palm tree, I'm just doing a very slight curved line going straight up, and then the next one next to it, and then we're going to curve it around. It almost looks a little bit like the top of a firework when the firework explodes. So just following these leaves around, just curving them as we get around the palm tree, and you might even have one at the front which almost goes over the trunk. Next up, we're going to add our leaves. So I'm sticking with this colour because we're going to be adding all the different layers on top, and I'm just doing curved swooping motions down each of our stalks. Just follow along the shape of that stalk, and if you've got them sort of sticking out the top, you would naturally see the leaves on either side of these lines. I'm leaving little gaps between them, and I'm just using a very light, almost flicking motion with my brush. It almost lifts off at the end just to give those leaves a sort of lifted look. I'm not overthinking this, and I'm working quite quickly, just getting into the rhythm of it. We're then going to start adding in our different colours over the top and just starting to blend in these leaves and really fill them in. Just make sure that all of the leaves are connected in the middle. Next up, I'm picking up another shade of green, adding a little bit of water to it just to make sure it's lovely and fluid. This will really help us get this nice, crisp line with our leaves. We can just go ahead and start adding some more lines over the top of the previous colour in between. We don't want to cover up all of the first shade of paint. This is nice. We're going to start seeing different tones and shades and shadows building up with our leaves now, and I'm just sticking with exactly the same technique. Really light touch. Lifting off the paintbrush as I get to the ends and just curving the leaves around, using that main shape of our stalk as a guide. Naturally, as they sort of fall to the sides of the tree, gravity will sort of pull the leaves down, but at the top they are quite stiff, so whenever you look at palm trees there are lots of the branches sort of sticking straight up into the air. And don't be afraid to overlap your leaves here. We want to make sure this looks like a lovely healthy palm tree, nice and filled. You can always take a step back if you want to. And then whenever you're ready, you can pick up your third colour. So I'm going for this darker shade of green now, just adding in that water, giving it a good mix and making sure I haven't got too much paint on my brush. You can just dab it off slightly and then go ahead and do exactly the same thing. If you feel like you need to darken up your paint colour, which I'm doing now, just adding a little bit more brown to it just to darken it up slightly because it was too similar to my mid shade. So you can adjust your colours as you go. And the same thing, you can just overlap some of the other colours. You don't have to do loads of these leaves if you don't want to, but it's nice to sort of add in a few darker tones in there as well. You can then go back to a previous colour if you want to. If you feel like you've lost some of the lighter shades, we can just reintroduce them back in. Just picking up some of this light green. Just dusting a few extra leaves on top of the darker shades. And if you want to, you can always go ahead and mix up a third colour as well. I'm just adding a slightly darker tone just towards the middle of the palm tree, just to make it look lovely and dense in that area. Maybe there are a few coconuts hiding underneath the leaves. I'm moving on now to mixing up a slightly lighter tone, so I'm just picking up a little bit of white and a little bit of yellow, mixing it in with that green and brown that's left on my brush, and this is just going to give us a bit of a highlight colour. So I'm just mixing that in, adding a little bit of water to it again, keeping it nice and fluid, and then we can use this colour just to add a little pop of highlight on the top. If you don't feel like you need to do this, you don't have to, And feel free to adjust your colours as you go. I like the idea that this yellow sort of reflects some of the sunset colours, warms up the leaves slightly. Moving on to our birds, I'm just using a pencil to sketch in the shape of the bird. So you can do this in any way that you like. You can also do a little elongated M shape and just have some birds flying in the distance, or an old school V shape, that will work as well. I'm just doing a sort of lemon-like shape to start with as the base, and then I'm doing quite an angles, almost like, I don't know, it looks a little bit like a triangle shape for the first wing on the right hand side, and then I'm going to do the same on the other side. So I've got that sort of lemon leaf like shape in the middle, and then the angled wings coming out either side. Feel free to practice this as well if you want to, first on a piece of paper or a scrap piece of card or anything that you've got. Just doing a sort of rounded shape to suggest the head. We're going to be filling this in with a block colour afterwards as well. And then for the tail, I'm just going to do another sort of triangle shape that sticks out towards the back, just slightly, just a small one. Next we've got another shape, so I'm starting with a very shallow mound, and then I'm doing the wings coming out either side. So this is going to be a bird that's sort of flying away from us. So we're basically seeing the span of the wings, and then I'm doing almost like a little sort of looks like a skirt, which will be the tail, and then the wing on the other side, again just a shallow, very thin shallow wing. We can always amend these slightly when we come to paint them in. And then we'll probably just see the bird's feet just coming out the back of the tail, sort of dangling in the air as it flies away. So I'm now just adding a little bit of black to my palette. I'm going to paint these in with a sort of dark grey colour, but you can paint them in with any shade that you want. You might want to go for more of a white colour and just keep them like doves, or you might want to do something a bit more abstract and paint them bright pink, anything that you want. I'm just going for a dark grey, just so you can really see the shapes in the distance. You'll often find as well, when you see the birds sort of flying with the sunset in the background, they're very much silhouetted against the sun. So I've just mixed up a dark grey here. I'm adding some water into it. We want to make sure again that the paint stays nice and fluid. It just helps us get lovely crisp lines when we come to painting in the birds. And I'm adding a little bit of brown to this just to warm up this colour ever so slightly. Now going in with a tiny brush and using the outline that I've already drawn myself, I'm just going to very carefully start filling it in. Just using a really light touch, small little brush strokes, just outlining where that pencil mark is and just filling them in with this colour or the colour of your choice. add a third bird in this corner as well. This is going to be a slightly smaller one flying in the distance. I'm just doing a sort of oval shape for the main body of the bird, and then just a line, a curved line going out either side, just so you can have a few options with the birds as well. You can practice these, you can decide which shape you prefer, and then as soon as you're happy you can go ahead and fill it in with the same colour. To finish up, I'm just going to add a few stars in the sky. So I'm using the other end of my brush, dipping it into the white paint, and I'm going to very carefully just dab that white paint into random areas, just a few little stars scattered at the top part of the canvas where the night sky is coming in. Just push down very lightly. You don't need too many, they're just sort of scattered in the distance. I hope you found today's tutorial interesting and helpful. We've learned a few different techniques with our background. We've learned how to paint in a palm tree and how to create a few different birds flying in the sky as well. If you like this video, then please be sure to give us a little thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out. We're Brush and Bubbles. We bring you new tutorials every week so you can get creative from the comfort of your own house. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really look forward to hearing from you soon. See you next time. Bye.